couple years ago, I was teaching English at this grade school in China, and they wanted us to perform at their annual spectacle. They all said spectacle, not spectacle, including the director of the English department, so we never bothered to correct them about it. At the spectacle, each class in the school did a little song and dance in front of all the other students and teachers and parents. And since it was a military school, they had officials from the government and from the military there as well. And in the past, the American student teachers had done a routine as well. So my group put together a medley of American music through the decades, which had ABBA, Michael Jackson, Vanilla Ice, and Ciara, since it was during the 2 weeks that Ciara was popular. We were a bunch of English majors, so performing wasn't really our forte, but we performed at the dress rehearsal and we're pretty happy with it. Then we got the feedback that our act wasn't American enough. They said that we danced like Chinese people, which I think would have been racist if it hadn't been coming from a Chinese person. The group of teachers immediately before us had some members from the Young Ambassadors in it, which is kind of like BYU's Glee Club, and they had clearly set the bar way, way too high. So the director of the school canceled all of our classes for the next week. So rather than teach kids English, i.e. the reason that we were living in rural China for 6 months, we got to figure out how to make ourselves more American. One of our group members had been a cheerleader for a year, so she taught us how to do some lifts and throws and other cheerleadery moves. I wasn't thrilled that cheerleading equaled America, but we were already saying that Vanilla Ice equaled America, so it wasn't any worse, I guess. Speaking of Brother Ice, those of us who hadn't already memorized Ice Ice Baby memorized it so that we could rap instead of lip syncing, so we could dazzle the audience that much more. We did some of these things. I have no idea why this is American. The Chinese had one more specific suggestion on how to make our act more American. Men dressed as women is funny. So in the end, I drew the short straw and ended up wearing a ball gown in front of several thousand Chinese nationals. Afterwards, audience members kept congratulating one of the girls in our group for her Dancing Queen performance, evidently being unable to tell that it was me in the dress and not her. The only thing worse than dressing like a girl in front of the Chinese military is being a girl who is told that she looks like me dressing like a girl in front of the Chinese military. After our adequately American performance at the spectacle, the school asked if we would perform at a local talent show. I'm not sure why we agreed, but we did. And we boarded this ramshackle bus and headed out for the weekend. Once we arrived, we discovered that the town wasn't a resort town, as we'd been told, but a village even tinier than the tiny village that we were living in already. And it wasn't as much a talent show as it was a Chinese game show and infomercial. In rural China, it's a big deal to have Americans around. People stopped us all the time to take our picture. So this particular village had decided that it would make a television program with a bunch of Americans in it, and then that would drum up tourism. So they invited all the Americans that they could find to compete in this game show in their sleepy little town. Most of them, however, knew that they were going to be in a game show. Our school's explanation why they didn't tell us the real situation was, we thought you wouldn't go, so we didn't tell you. The show might have gone okay if it were actually a talent show. We had memorized Ice Ice Baby after all. But it was actually a calligraphy competition. Those Americans that they had invited were mostly art students studying Chinese calligraphy. There was a tiny talent show portion of the show, but the biggest part of the competition was a timed onstage calligraphy showdown. The final part was grading of our calligraphy portfolios. Problem was, we didn't have portfolios, being amateur English instructors, not professional calligraphers. And we might have prepared something had our school told us that we were entering a competition. But since they didn't, we had to stay up most of the night making up calligraphy to enter. I suspect our final products were a bit worse than your average Chinese toddler's finger painting. We didn't win the game show. Part of the reason for my trip was an extreme form of procrastination, so I wouldn't have to go to my med school interviews. But this did mean that once I got back to the US, I had to start doing them right away, such as the day right after I arrived. We were a couple hours into our Air China flight when the plane rocked a little bit. I'd be lying if I said that I thought much of it. A while later, the same thing happened, a little bit more noticeably. The pilot made an announcement over the speakers, which didn't really mean much to us as it was in Mandarin and didn't include the half-dozen words of Mandarin that we could remember. But immediately every other person in the plane that did speak Mandarin started speaking it to each other. Eventually we were able to get a flight attendant to tell us what was going on. Evidently the first little bump had been one of our engines ceasing to function. Not to worry, there were 3 more. The second bump was another engine stopping. Not to worry, there were 2 more. But the captain, being a scaredy cat, had decided not to fly the remaining 5,000 miles across the Pacific on half the preferred number of engines. So we were turning around. Rather than land at the nearest landmass, Japan, or even the closest Chinese airport, we had to go all the way back to Shanghai. We landed and everyone got off the plane with some Mandarin instructions telling them what to do. With no English instructions, we just followed everybody else. Eventually we were able to ascertain that Air China would have to get us another flight. That flight would be our flight, as in they wanted us to take the same plane to the US that we had just gotten off of because half of its engines had stopped. So we needed to wait for that plane to be fixed. How long would that take? No one knew. We were to wait in a hotel room, and they'd call us as soon as the plane was ready, and then we'd take off. Would they call us in English? They couldn't promise that. So we spent the next 36 hours in a hotel with only our carry-on luggage and without any money because we'd exchanged it all, and with one of us sitting by the phone at all times. I didn't spend all my time waiting, however, splitting my time between waiting and frantically rescheduling med school interviews, which I was now missing. Being stranded in China after my plane almost crashed seemed very much like my dog ate my homework, but hopefully the schools would believe me. Eventually they called, telling us that we'd be leaving in 2 hours. This time the flight did not crash, or even lose a single engine. It did, however, lose my luggage.